Welcome to the Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig Lyndall, joined by Andrew Schnitkey. How's it going, Andrew?
I can tell you, I can answer that more easily here in a few hours after I know the results of the Cleveland Guardians game 4 today. So kind of nervous about that. We're recording this right before the game, so right now I'm doing pretty good, but my mood can definitely change here over the next few hours. We'll see.
Yeah, this isn't a sports podcast, but I wish I cared more. I wish I cared like I used to back in the '90s. It's been fun jumping in on the playoffs, but I felt very out of touch with baseball as a whole. Probably the last 3 or 4 years, but especially this year. It's very strange.
Yeah, like not to get too into the weeds for our people who don't care about sports at all, but here locally in Ohio, there's been major issues with the streaming rights for the Guardians games. So Bally Sports, which covers or carries the broadcasts, they basically pulled it from all of the streaming services, YouTube TV, Hulu TV, all those. And so those of us who are cord cutters have had no way to watch them, and we're blacked out locally, so we can't subscribe to MLB TV and watch. So I've very much been in the same boat where I think you and I are both similar in that, when, again, I know we're getting too far into the weeds here for Cleveland baseball folks, but when Victor Martinez was traded, I know that was a huge impact moment for both of us where I think we kind of fell out with baseball for a while, and then not being able to watch the last couple of years has definitely not been as fun, but I have YouTube TV, and so I've really enjoyed getting to watch these playoff games.
Yeah. And I think that's universal. I think other people all around the country are dealing with these kinds of things. And I know international soccer fans deal with different streaming rights and streaming situations. It's very hard this day in the fractured environment, very similar to a lot of other media outlets, movies and stuff, where you just can't always get what you're looking for easily. It's a Google search to even figure out where it's supposed to be. And that's another thing, by the way. Like, if you ask me what TV network I've even been watching these baseball games on, I don't know that I could tell you. It could be TNT or TBS or NBC.
True TV, baby. True TV.
What is True TV? I don't even know.
I don't know. It's this thing that occasionally carries sport. Like, they get March Madness games and playoff baseball games. The rest of the time, I have no idea what's on True TV.
All right, well, let's talk about some new music. Sometimes we go way back in the catalogs. When we talk about new music, I feel like we talk about the kind of new music that hits on or builds off of a lot of these legacy type sounds that would sound familiar to you. We're going to talk about Drug Church today first, and then we've talked briefly about All Hell by Los Campesinos, but now that we've had the record for a couple months, we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into it, because I feel like you and I really know that record now. But first, Drug Church. You and I kind of jumped on the Drug Church bandwagon on their last record. Hygiene came out in 2022.
Yeah.
And then I did go back and listen to some of their previous releases, but it was kind of fun to jump in on a band that had a couple of records in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I certainly, definitely Cheer was the album that I went back and listened to retroactively going back. And for people not familiar, Drug Church, I guess you would call them a hardcore band. I think they would call themselves hardcore, but like I don't know that. I don't think that like does justice like to what they actually sound like. I think when you listen to these guys, you will hear a lot of influence from that 90s grunge sound. Like, you will hear those thick guitars, the quiet, loud dynamic. They do that really well. So like they're much more melodic than what you would typically get from a lot of hardcore. But yeah, you know, their new album that they just put out a couple weeks ago on October 4th is called Prude. And I watched a documentary on the making of the album on YouTube that they self-produced. And it's pretty cool. But the producer who did all three of these albums, Cheer, Hygiene, and Prude, talked about how he really views this as a trilogy set of albums. And I think that makes sense. There's a lot of through lines through all of these albums. There's certain elements that you will feel familiar with as you go through these albums. You know, we talked last week about Foxing, and Foxing is a band that never does the same thing twice. All their albums are pretty radically different. That's not really what you get so much with Drug Church. But going back to like, certainly like Cheer was like this album, like I would say probably where I do hear the most roots in hardcore would definitely be Cheer. But moving into Hygiene, the album you and I first discovered and the one that we really fell in love with, that was the one where what blew me away about it was in an era in which so many bands sort of try to do almost too much. And I appreciate people who push the envelope. We talk about a lot of bands who borrow from different genres and mix and match things. But like Drug Church was this band, like particularly on Hygiene, where it just felt like there was no pretentiousness with it. Like it was just a straightforward rock album. And I think that's certainly what I first fell in love with. And I think you were kind of similar with that.
Yeah, it was refreshing in that way because without dumbing it down and without insulting it, it was accessible. You could swallow it, you know. It was straight ahead guitars and drums. The vocals are kind of barky and kind of maybe a little bit screamy, but screamy in the way that like the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones were.
Yeah.
There are definitely notes and melodies going on, even if it is kind of aggressive. It's not pleasing to your parents necessarily, but like that's not what you and I are looking for in our rock music anyway. But the song structures, you could always there were noticeable choruses. There's like it's going to sound strange to say it, but there's like a pop sensibility to the song structure, even though like I wouldn't call this pop by any means at all. These guys definitely know how to write songs that have that familiar feel that the first time you hear it, everything kind of makes sense. And in with the kind of music that you and I listen to and the all the different types of things that we listen to, sometimes it's refreshing just to hear something that makes sense the first or second time you hear it.
Yeah, and I think what you really get with this band is certainly like a really solid rhythm section. The drums and bass are really just on point for what these songs are trying to do. But then you've got, you know, your rhythm guitar, which is straight Les Paul, Marshall sound. I don't know if he plays through Marshalls actually, but that's kind of the sound. You know, the Les Paul Marshall feel is what you're getting from the rhythm guitars, and then the lead guitarist, he's playing a lot of like jazz master guitars, and he's doing these like almost like Kurt Cobain type lead plays on it. So if you can kind of think of like that Kurt Cobain sound with like a lot of chorus on the guitar on the sound, you know, these like leads that really cut through and add a lot of sort of dimension to a lot of these songs. And then the vocalist Patrick Kinlan, he's a really interesting guy. I love interviews with this guy. He's Dan Ozzie, who I've talked about in this podcast a lot, on his newsletter not too long ago. He had a really great extensive interview with Patrick. He's a really like he gets called like in a lot of interviews I see, like people always talk about him as a contrarian of sorts, that he can be sometimes they'll say he's like a difficult interview, but I never found him to be that. I don't think he's difficult, but he's just not going to give you a standard like textbook answer. Like you see so many interviews with musicians who just give you the same old type of answer, and Patrick always has like sort of a left field way of thinking about things. Like, so most people might think about things this way. He tries to think about it in coming from the other direction, and that might be where he gets this contrarian label. But I think that plays well into his lyrics. A lot of his lyrics are sort of a take on a lot of like the working man trope, and putting like these unique spins on this experience of, you know, people just getting through life, going through life day to day, and the struggles that we all have. And it's extraordinarily relatable lyrics throughout the board. So I think that's, you know, with Drug Church, like that's just kind of what you're getting. But I'll say on Prude, I don't know, like I don't think you've listened to this one quite as much as I have, but I don't know if you noticed the same way I did that they really did lean a lot more into melody. Like that's kind of what is sort of added to this album compared to the others. I think a lot of Patrick's vocals, like I totally agree with you that they are generally very barky, but he has a lot more vocal melody in this album than previous, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to your point about him being a contrarian, I think he is a contrarian in a lot of ways, but the way he presents it, it's not defensive. And so when he finishes telling you his philosophies on life and whatever else, it just sounds like common sense almost. Like I always say common sense isn't common sense until you've heard it at least once. And then it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it becomes common sense. He sometimes it feels like he's ahead of his time in these interviews. It feels like
Yeah.
um you know, he was prepared for like the social media era before anybody else was. I
Yes,
know there's
very much so.
one question in particular that you kind of shared with me, or one answer in particular that you shared with me. Why don't you if you can recall that one a little bit?
Yeah, they asked him about, so he mentions in multiple interviews his stance that like he is incapable of being offended. And so he was asked about what exactly that meant. And he's like, well, he's like, quite frankly, he's like, for anybody else to offer an opinion to me, like the first thing you need to ask yourself is, why do you care about their opinion? Like so many people in today's internet world offer up opinions out into the ether, and like these people get into arguments with strangers, like these really heated, visceral arguments with complete strangers on the internet, whether it be politics, sports, you know, even
Which
music,
band
like what,
sucks?
yeah,
Yeah,
which band sucks. And he's like, why are you arguing with somebody that you don't know and you don't value their opinion, you know? And then he even referenced oh, I don't remember who it was. Was it Todd McFarlane? I think it was
I think
Todd
so.
McFarlane that he referenced an interview where he talked about how, like, you know, he works with, you know, doing his graphic design. He works with a lot of different companies who he gets a lot of opinion and people telling him that what they need to do and how he should listen to them. And he's like, look, I I don't listen to my dad, and I love my dad. So why on earth would I listen to you? You know, and
Yeah,
and like it's kind of so again, that is in today's like in today's political climate, that is a contrarian take. You know, this idea of rather than getting offended, like just don't worry about what other people are saying. It is sort of a contrarian thing, but it is in some other ways also, though, a really healthy way to navigate through, particularly social media. Now, the interesting thing about this is that interview was from like 2013. It was like in the infancy of Twitter, where this hadn't really become a full-throated phenomenon yet, but I think he was probably relating it to like message board forums, because that used to be the place you would go to yell at people on the internet.
especially in punk and hardcore, those message boards ruled the internet in terms of this type of music. Absolutepunk.net, a lot of those places is where teenagers and mostly dudes in their 20s just lived all day, every day, talking about music and talking shit about this record or this band or that band. And God forbid somebody got themselves into trouble. The pylons on those message boards would just be unbelievable. And you know,
Yeah.
people try, much like people do on Twitter and social media today, people trying to make a name for themselves in their criticism and in their fandom. Um, trying to be gatekeepers and thought leaders and whatever else. And meanwhile, if you're one of the artists who's actually committing your lyrics to the page and to the record and singing them and screaming them in front of audiences, like, you gonna care about what, Jerry on Absolute Punk says?
Exactly. And I think that's, something that you and I, we, for people who don't know, Craig and I used to own a sports blog, and this was back in the day when comments was a big thing. You'd have the comments section on articles, and one of the decisions we had made pretty early on our site was that we had a no tolerance policy for any name calling or any of these kind of, like, we were not going to be a place to allow that kind. And we probably would have gotten more people to stick around, because that sort of thing, that arguing with strangers on the internet phenomenon, like, definitely leads to higher retention. But we just shut it down all the time. We would block people and ban them if they violated that. That was like our number one rule. And as a result, we cultivated a really uniquely healthy environment in which people could discuss sports. And, but like, thinking about it through this lens, like, maybe we went the wrong direction, and maybe instead we should have just told people, just don't argue, because why do you care what these other people are saying to you about who should be the starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns?
Right. And I wrote the article. You shouldn't care what I think either.
Yeah, exactly. So,
oh, it's so funny. Yeah, not that anybody's going to care about this, but it was so funny because this one time we had this horrible repeat offender who we banned, and they ended up turning in a Better Business Bureau complaint against us, which we had to answer for some reason, which was hysterical. Better Business Bureau because of a blog comment section.
A random installation of WordPress that existed on the internet, and apparently the Better Business Bureau had to follow up with us.
You know what? I'm going to file a Better Business Bureau complaint against Elon for the next time you ban somebody on Twitter.
There we go. There we go. I'm sure that'll get just as far. Is the Better Business Bureau even still a thing?
Of course it is. I mean, somehow, some way they, because, well, yeah, that's like a whole racket.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Drug Church puts out this new record. I know that you and I were both really looking forward to it. And then when it hit, in some ways, like, the fact that it sounds like the third part in a trilogy is a good thing. The downside of that, and I'll get over it, and I will listen to this obsessively, and I will get to know it really well. But the first time through, I was like, yep, sounds like a really good Drug Church record. I like it. I'll keep listening to it. But I didn't feel the urgency necessarily that I've felt with some other different new releases this year. As much as I love it and as great as it is, I'll take my time with it, and it doesn't really demand that I go any quicker.
I think that's perfectly fair. And I don't think my initial reaction on first listen was all that different. I really liked it, and I knew I was going to keep listening to it, but I don't think it quite immediately grabbed me the way Hygiene did, because it did feel a little bit familiar to me.
Yeah.
But I will say, this is not apples to apples, but in a similar vein to the way, like, listening to the Foxing album, once I got to 5 times through listening and I really understood what they were doing with all the different songs, it really, like, took it to the next level. And I think this Drug Church album, Prude, hit me the exact same way. On second listen, I liked it better. Third listen, even better. Fourth listen, even better. And I've listened to this album, God, probably like 15 times already. Like, I am all the way in on this one. This is it's
in 6 days.
Yeah, it's not gonna top. Well, it's also a 30-minute album, so, like, I can, like, play it basically on my commute to work and then listen to it again on my commute home. So I sort of rack up the plays, and it can be one of those albums, if I have it on repeat on Spotify, like, for the whole album, and I have the whole repeat on, like, I can listen to it multiple times through before I realize, like, oh, I just listened to this 3 times in a row, because it's so short.
10 songs, 28 minutes and 44 seconds.
Yeah, so lightning quick album. But you know, as I kept listening to it, I really did begin to hear also the ways this does separate itself from Hygiene. And I do actually now view these as very different albums. Like I said earlier, there's definitely some common throughput. Like, think you're going to connect strands all the way through back to Cheer. So going back, Cheer, Hygiene, and now Prude. And for if you guys aren't familiar with them, you know, really listen to all three. They're all great albums, but I really can hear the ways that this is different. And the big thing I keep harping on with this is just, to me, how melodic it is, and not just in Patrick's vocals, but also some of Nick Cogan's lead guitar play on this as well. I think he really came up with some really almost catchy guitar leads on this that really take a lot of these choruses to the next level. During the verses, you know, they tend to be pretty in the pocket, and then when you get to the verse, he tends to like really lay these really catchy melodic leads on top of the music. And I'll just talk about a couple standout tracks maybe real quick before we move on.
Well, yeah, before you get there though, because like
Yeah.
we're in a world where charts don't mean anything. There's no radio airplay. So I always look at Spotify, and I found this really interesting. They have 225,000 monthly listeners, and if you look at the popular songs, the top five are all from the new record. And if
Yeah.
you expand it out to the top 10, they're all from the new record. And one of them is Weed Pin from Cheer, which is obvious, which is easily their biggest song.
Right.
But so that indicates to me that their fan base is all about this new record. They're not going, it's okay, but I'm going to go back to XYZ album. They're diving in and they're all in on it.
That seems to be the reaction I've seen from fans that I've seen. You know,
How great must that be for a band, though?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you want. Like, when you're a band of this size, you just want your fan base to be along with you for the ride, you know? And you do see it happen occasionally with bands where they put out an album and their fans are just like, all right, I'm out. And
I'm going to go back to listen to the one that I love from 6 years ago.
Yep. And I just think Prude is a strong enough album. Like, this is, I doubt that it's going to end up above Foxing. I'm still pretty set that Foxing is almost certainly going to be my favorite album of the year, but I would think Prude is going to probably find its way into the top 5 for me. I think it's that strong. Yeah, just to talk about a couple different songs and to kind of give I'll talk about this song, Business Ethics. It might be my favorite song on the album. I think in many ways, I talked about this a little bit earlier today, but I think in a lot of ways, this is a perfect song. And I don't say that lightly. Like, I think this is a perfectly executed rock song. And musically, it's phenomenal, of course. But I think Patrick's lyrics on this is one of the like most clever lyrical concepts. So the basic gist of this song, he starts off talking about his cousin who needs money for drugs, and he's always hatching up all these schemes, and he comes up with this idea to try to kidnap himself and call his mom and ask for ransom, you know. And then he talks about how he needs some time off of work and his boss won't let him, so he comes up with this idea of kidnapping himself again, you know. So it keeps coming back to these like sort of like harebrained schemes to, you know, find a way to get money and time and freedom and all that. And then it ends with this part about how you need to like really get your stuff together and come up with a way to actually make money. And like, so it's like, come up with one last scheme, this scheme to rule all schemes. And then he ends it with, you know, my cousin needs money for drugs. And then he ends it with, so he came up with the scheme and now he works in finance. And it's like this really like great like way to just end it with the ultimate like tongue-in-cheek turn on this where you least expect it. And he's again making sort of this commentary on both, people who are struggling with addiction and the things people do just to get by in life versus, you know, the middle class working man. And then you sort of realize like they're all kind of the same experience. And like, I just think that's just lyrically, just a perfectly executed song. The album Closer, which we're big closer people here. We love a good album closer. I think this is a perfect closer for this album. It's one of the catchiest songs on the album. It's called Peer Review, and I love this one too because again, Patrick's talking about this concept of how we always judge ourselves by our peers and we think we're better than everybody else. But then he talks about like when you actually like look around and you realize like, hey, these peers, these are the people that you're stuck with. Like you better get used to it and make do because you think you're better than them, but these are the people you're surrounded with. So they are your peers and you're sort of the same ilk. And I really appreciated that. And that's, again, some of my favorite lead work on this album is in the second half of that song. It's a really great closer. And then like I'll even talk about like the third track on this called Hey Listen, which I think is by far the catchiest album or song that Drug Church has ever done. Like it is a super catchy song. It's the most like thought out or complete vocal melody I think that Patrick's ever done. I really like that song as well. And I mean, there's so many songs on this. Myopic, Slide to Me is great.
Myopic was the pre-release single or whatever. It's a great one to pull you in and let you know that Drug Church is coming back with a new record.
Yeah. So those are some of the standouts to me, but I like every single song on this album. And I just, I want to talk about it. For people who aren't familiar with them, like if you're listening to our podcast, you like rock music, like you just like guitars, drums, bass, like you will like this band. I promise you.
This is one of those that if you were in on the 90s and you really loved all the grunge and the post-grunge bands, this band would have had one big radio hit, and then they would have had a couple 100,000 hardcore fans who would have kept riding with them, even if they never followed it up with another big radio hit. The other thing that we have to talk about before we move on is that this is another release. Like, how many albums are going to be in your top 10 this year from Pure Noise Records? Because you got Drug Church, Cloud Nothings, Knocked Loose, See You Space Cowboy. Unfortunately, Microwave probably won't make my list this year, but Microwave is a great band. They had a new release this year. Does Prince Daddy have anything coming out this year?
I don't think so. I haven't seen anything coming out from them. I feel like there was another one too, but maybe
Spanish Love Songs.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't think that was out this year. I think that was last year.
Was that last year?
My brain doesn't work for when new music came out.
You're right. I actually think I'm pretty positive that it was last year.
But like labels are back, man. Labels are back in a way that I didn't think they would ever come back, just because I didn't think that they would matter. But the collection of talent on this roster, this current roster, and this doesn't even include some of the past releases and classics. By the way, another band that I saw live this year who has a record coming out that I'm going to force you to listen to, and force is strong because you'll try anything a couple times. You're going to love the new Ben Quad record too. I'm convinced you're going to love that band.
Yeah. I think Pure Noise is sort of the new Sub Pop. Like in the 90s, like Sub Pop, like when a band signed to Sub Pop, you kind of it was like getting a stamp of approval. Like, this is a good band. And like, I mean, you can go to Pure Noise's website. It's an awesome website too, really well designed to get you to the bands that you want to hear. But they also have links to some Spotify playlists that they've put together that you can listen to. Like their hardcore playlist is awesome. Like I'll just sometimes put that on and just listen to all the hardcore bands that they have on their label. They're really running this the way you would want a label to be run in the 2020s. And talking about like labels being back too, like this one this one won't make like major waves for everybody, but the band Scowl, they just announced that they moved to Dead Oceans and they put out a song, and it's a really catchy song. It's really good. But like, what's funny is they actually got some backlash because it's not a hardcore label, and this idea that what is this hardcore band doing going to a label that's not a hardcore label, and they're get the sellout name is getting tossed around, which they were already getting because they were in Taco Bell commercials. Their last EP, like, the singer Kat Moss didn't scream much. She was pretty much singing clean vocals, and that this offended the ethos of the underground and the hardcore. But so I do think it's funny though that, like, I see so many times these news alerts of bands going to different labels, and like, you do have sort of this idea or a preconceived notion of what that means depending on what label they go to. So I do think it's kind of interesting.
All right. So one other thing about Drug Church that you and I discovered right before we went live on the air is that they share a band member with Military Gun, and like you and I didn't even know.
I really feel like, not embarrassed is the wrong word, maybe ashamed that I didn't realize this, because like, I love both of these bands and listen to them all the time. And Craig knows that when I get into a band, I like get obsessive about it. Like, I'll try to find everything I can learn about them, find every YouTube interview I can find. Like, I want to know what makes these bands tick. And while I certainly knew a lot about Ian Shelton, the singer of Military Gun, I actually somehow just did not realize that Nick Cogan, the guitarist in Military Gun, is the lead guitarist in Drug Church as well. So, sometimes I'm just not on my game, I guess.
We're gonna forgive you. We'll forgive you.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
So we go from a label.
Everybody just stopped listening because they're like, this guy doesn't know that Nick Cogan is in both Drug Church and Military Gun. Come on,
man. His indie rock, his independent music bona fides are destroyed.
That's
destroyed.
Right. That's right. I'm a poser.
Yeah. So we're a couple gentlemen in middle age. That's how it goes. Yeah. We go from a superstar label with a roster to a band that self-released a record with no label. Los Campesinos from Wales. Their record is All Hell. We talked a little bit about it back on the Smashing Pumpkins episode, but it's been quite a while, and now I think it's appropriate for us to kind of dive in a lot more. But
I don't think we gave this the attention that it deserved, so we're going to rectify that.
And part of what had us interested in this record, I think, was the story around how it was released, and the much like Foxing, it's a DIY endeavor where they kind of did it all themselves, including the marketing and the promotion. And it just, the story itself, the music is great. Don't get me wrong. If the music wasn't good, it doesn't matter what the storyline is around it. But if the music is already great and then the storyline is cool to boot, it's that much better. So can you kind of run everybody through some of the highlights of the storyline of the independent release and independent marketing and stuff?
Yeah. So, I think, Los Campesinos, they've been around forever. I mean, they've been around 20 years probably by now, right? Wouldn't you say?
I would think so.
I'm pretty sure it was early 2000s when they put out their first album. I feel like 2002.
It says 2006 to present.
Oh, 2006. Okay. But so going on 20 years. And I think that for a lot of people, while like they had sort of become a band that they put out an album and you'd listen to it and you'd be excited to listen to it. But I think people felt like from a like creative tour de force, they had maybe sort of just become set in what they were doing. I don't know if that's totally fair, but I that was just kind of the sense I got reading reviews of their last couple albums before this one. And then they went totally independent. They no label, but they entirely self-recorded this album. They mixed it and produced it themselves. And like Craig mentioned, they did the marketing entirely themselves, and they just put out this album. And what's cool about it is that they then went back and showed us some of the figures on the costs of doing this themselves, which is really cool. You can find a social media post. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember what the numbers are, but they showed like what they essentially did for marketing. And they're like, you could get, if you're like an established band like Los Campesinos, and when I say established, like if you're into indie music, you are certainly familiar with Los Campesinos. They are an established indie rock band. But they, for a band that size, like they don't need a lot of word of mouth exactly. They sort of just need to get it out there that they have an album coming out, and their fans kind of take over from there. Your Stereo Gums, Pitchforks, they're going to write about it that, oh, hey, Los Campesinos has a new album coming out. So they showed how, relatively speaking, they did not have to spend all that much money to do the marketing side for this album. I think probably a lot of the cost was probably just in studio time and recording.
All right, so here are the details on their marketing spend for this release. They spent 191 pounds.
Yeah.
They spent 103 pounds for the album marquee on Spotify. They did a pre-order advertisement on Meta, Facebook, $27. Release week ads, $61. I say dollars, but I mean pounds. Grand total 191.
So, I mean, that's not a lot of money.
But this is really funny. Online print press PR. Instead of hiring PR, we email writers directly to send them, ask if they would like to hear the album. Radio plugger. We have never got radio plays, so there's no point in us doing this. We thank this guy, Hugh Stevens, for the plays off his own back. Legend.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But, that kind of speaks, though, to what I was saying. Like, Los Campesinos can shoot an email to Stephen Hayden and Ian Cohen and say, hey, we've got a new album coming out. You guys want to hear it? And their answer is going to be yes. It's no brainer. Yes. And so if you're a band that's just getting started, this may not be quite as effective for you, but I think it's cool to see that, like, it's we talk about confidence a lot when we talk about bands. Like, we appreciate a band that has sort of a confident sound and they kind of know who they are. And I think that's, to me, All Hell is the ultimate, like, confident Los Campesinos. Like, they didn't need anybody's help anymore. Like, they know who they are. They know how to write damn good rock song. And they can just kind of like say, hey, like, we've got this piece of work. Who wants to hear it? And you're going to get a decent amount of attention out of it. And I think that doing it this way, though, seemed to spark a little bit of creativity in the songwriting. I really feel, I know we talked about this in the last one, that this idea that this is a bit of a return to form. But when we say return to form, it's like taking all these elements of all the previous eras of Los Campesinos and combining it into a coherent beginning to, and this is a coherent beginning to end album. Like, it's divided up into parts. It's a very clear beginning, middle, and end to this album. And I think that only a band that has been around for a while could have the confidence to be like, all right, we're going to do this album this way. We're going to make it ourselves. We're going to market it ourselves. We're going to put it out there. We're going to let our legacy sort of carry us on this. And I think it's made it a better album because of that.
Yeah. And it is, compared to a lot of the things that we talk about, it's kind of sprawling. It's 15 tracks.
Yeah.
It's 49 minutes. It's almost not quite an hour, but it's one of those records that when you finish listening to it, you're fine starting it over again. It doesn't drag. It doesn't feel like you've been sitting there for the better part of an hour. And to your point, the songwriting feels graduated to a point, like where the songwriting felt this good in spots in their entire career. Now it is just so thick. this record is just so thick. It doesn't feel like there are any moments off or songs where they're just, kind of throwing them in there because they wrote them and they wanted to include them. Um, it wouldn't surprise me if there were 25 or 30 songs in the running and these are just the best 15, or it's probably more like 14 with a filler track or whatever. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that this band uh, is at the top of its game and probably doesn't have any business being at the top of its game at this point in their career, which is, it
Yeah.
almost sounds rude to say that, but I mean it as a compliment.
Yeah, like I was stunned. Like I had gotten to the point where they've been around long enough that for me, my favorite album was Romance is Boring. And I just kind of had accepted that they were never going to be able to top that. Well, I actually think that All Hell is my favorite Los Campesinos album. And I think it's ridiculous that a band almost 18 years in the making puts out what I think is actually their best album. It's the most complete beginning to end album. So many of their albums, there are like sections of it that I absolutely love. And then there are sections where I almost feel like they sort of lose me a little bit. And I don't know if I can put my finger on what it is exactly that makes me feel that way, but I just feel like a lot of their albums are uneven. And this one is just, I thoroughly enjoy this the second I start it until the second that it's over. And I sort of feel that way about Romance is Boring, but I think this one's even stronger. I
Yeah,
don't know, like
my
what
go ahead.
was your favorite? What was your favorite Los Campesinos? Was it also Romance?
No, my favorite record is Hello Sadness by a long shot.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and it's weird because that one, of all the records in their catalog of records, I feel like that's the biggest outlier. And so in some ways, it doesn't make sense to me that I'm also a fan of their other records, because I like the one that's just absolutely miserable and kind of sullen. But you know, I notably I am not a person who enjoys party music very much. But for some reason, when Los Campesinos are screaming "Avocado Baby," I'm in, and I don't feel like I should be based on my own personal preferences, because that's the kind of thing that I would normally reject. But something about the authenticity of these I not this band and these members putting that stuff together, and the way they pull it off live, their live shows are just legendary, just complete and utter parties. That yeah, I it's it it doesn't make sense to me that I'm as big a fan of this band as I am, but that
Yeah.
just goes to show how good I think the material is. That it makes me kind of defy my own personal preferences to some degree.
I truly believe that Los Campesinos at their absolute peak, like when their songs are really hitting, are truly one of the best bands in the world. Like truly, like their absolute peak of the mountain greatness is really high up there. Now they don't
The
always sustain
the
that.
lyrics can be subversive, they can be
Yes,
funny, they're always
fantastic.
creative, and I'm not
It's
a
not all
lyrics
that
guy.
it's not all that undifferent from Patrick Kinlan's style of who we just talked about. It's not all that different from his style of lyrics either. Gareth David is the singer of Los Campesinos.
Gareth something.
Yeah, I think it's Gareth David. They went for a long time. Everybody's last name was Campesino in the band, so
Yeah,
like it's hard
the
to always
Ramones.
remember what their names are. But they actually dropped that for this album as well. And his lyrics are super funny. They're always clever, but he also has this way of making it feel like you're being invited to be a part of something. Like Los Campesinos has always had that, like sort of a almost like a cult. I'll say a cult like approach to being a rock band. Like you're either with them or you're not with them. Like it was this like idea of like this insular, like we are Los Campesinos, the whole blood pact thing. Like,
Well, and also campesino means peasant in Spanish. So
yeah.
we're the peasants, and they're from Wales. So they're a Welsh
Yeah.
band with a Spanish name and an exclamation point on the end of it. Like
Yes.
it all feels very ironic, but
Yeah.
not in a way that I reject it.
I think that's a good way of putting it. But yeah, so I just we've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of our favorite albums of the year, and I don't know where you sort of have this right now, but like again, I think this is another one that feels like it's probably going to end up in my top 5, and I almost feel like I'm saying that too much. Like I can only have five albums in my top 5, but it can't fit more than that in the top 5. But like this year 2024 has just been such a crazy year, because for so many months of the year, I felt like Meat Bodies was going to be my favorite album of the year. I've talked about that album a lot earlier in the year when it came out, and that album has stayed with me all year. And I just really felt like, well, 2024, it's a pretty good year, but I don't know that anything's going to top it. And then we've just been hammered with like Knocked Loose comes out, and then that was like, geez, this is a great album, and then Los Campesinos, Foxing, Drug
Cloud
Church,
Nothings,
Cloud Nothings, like even
and Dark Matter, Pearl Jam, Dark Matter.
Yeah, Dark Matter. See You Space Cowboys album is phenomenally great. Like there's just so many albums that feel like they could be top 5 albums this year.
When I was going to laugh at you a little bit when you were bringing this topic up, this part of the topic up, because like how do you decide between All Hell and Knocked Loose? How do you decide between Cloud Nothings and Knocked Loose? How do you fit any of these things in? And that's not even to mention like Infant Island and Foxing. You've got such disparate, impossibly different types of records that are pretty incomparable. So then it just comes down to, what did I feel like I enjoyed a little bit better, even though I enjoyed them all immensely?
Yeah. I always go with the approach, like when I do my year-end list, my sort of methodology is to like imagine I'm on a desert island and they're going to take all my records away, but I can keep one. And so that's sort of the like, so if I'm comparing 2 albums, it's like, okay, so I've got Los Campesinos and I've got Knocked Loose. I'm only going to get to keep one of them. And it's hard because different moods.
We should do this
I'm
live
not
on
in
the air.
mood. Yeah. And so like, I'll just be like, well, and I'm not going to answer it right now, but I will ultimately decide this is the album I would say I want to keep. So it gets ranked ahead of that. And I'll like just keep going up the ladder, like going through and finding until I find an album that I wouldn't want to keep this over. And then, okay, so that's the slot for that. And then I move on to the next album. So it's an inexact science. And it could, like anything in life, when you're talking about sort of subjective opinions, like I could make my list, my top 10 albums, but have me do it a week later and the order is going to be different. So, it's also sort of depends on the time when you do it too.
Well, and every style for me kind of has an era. So like, obviously Pearl Jam hits when I was 12, 13, 14. But when you get into something that feels very indie rock, like Los Campesinos, that brings me back to my mid to late 20s, probably. Something like Knocked Loose brings me to my late teens, early 20s, because that's when I really was into heavy music in a way that it was formative. And then Foxing is like, all right, I'm somewhere in my early 20s. And it's like, but everything hits on a different era where choosing a favorite or a top feels very difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. It's like not, and again, we are always clear on this podcast that everything is a subjective opinion, that, we're just because we think this album is great doesn't mean you necessarily will. But having said that, again, if you like rock music, you're probably going to like this album. You will certainly like aspects of this album, I would say.
Well, and I think you and I are fair enough to say sometimes that we dislike very good records. Like sometimes you'll give me something that you say is good or interesting, and I'll say, yeah, I hear why this is good, but it's not for me. And so otherwise perfectly great records that should make your top 5, like, not going to be anywhere near mine. and that doesn't make me right. It just means
Yeah.
that like that's not my cup of tea.
Like I run into this with Bon Iver all the time. Like Craig's constantly telling me how great Bon Iver is. And not just Craig, literally like everybody tells me how great Bon Iver is. And I listen to it and I just don't like it. For whatever reason, it just
Yeah.
doesn't work for me and it's not my thing. But again, yes, I can objectively hear why everybody likes it, but it just doesn't do it for me. And so subjectively, I don't like it. So,
Yeah. Same with Waxahachie, MJ
oh yeah,
Lenderman.
Waxahachie, I can definitely tell you why I don't like, but
Yes.
some things I can't be as specific about. What like an MJ Lenderman's a great one. Like that's one I know I should like. I have every reason to like MJ Lenderman. There's no reason for me to not love him the same way you do, but I just don't. I don't like.
Yeah.
I listen to it and I'm just like, I don't know. This just it. Like I went into his new album. I was really excited about it. I wanted this to be the breakthrough album that I was going to love. And, it gets great reviews everywhere. Everybody loves that album, but for me, it's just not something that clicks.
And then there's the midway too. Like I still will never love Zach Bryan as much as you do.
Yeah.
But I've grown to appreciate it. And there are a couple songs that grab me to the point where I think 28 is one of the best songs of the year.
Yeah.
And so like there's that middle ground where you find respect and you become a fan of a tiny fraction.
Yeah, for sure. So,
all right, you got anything else?
I don't think so. Do you have like a couple tracks on All Hell that are standout for you especially? Like I would say for me, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, definitely a Psychic Wound. That's the third track on the record. That one just smacks me in the face every single time in a good way. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
And then Feast of Tongues. If I had to pick two, if I had to chop the rest of the album out and just pick two songs, I would probably pick Feast of Tongues and Psychic Wound.
I actually think I would pick the same two if I had to. Like those songs are just awesome. Like
they're great.
I really like Coin Op Guillotine a lot. It's a great way to open the album. I really like that whole sequence of Long Throws, Feast of Tongues, and Order of the Seasons. I love those three songs back to back. It's a great middle section of the album. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier. Like you can sort of divide this up into a beginning, middle, and end, and they all have, their peaks and valleys, and it just flows really naturally. But there's just elements of each of those sections that I really love. And it's I don't know, just a really great album. I mean, 2024 has just been a ridiculously good year for music, very top heavy. And so, I'm glad we could finally talk about this album in a little more depth than we did previously. So.
Yeah, me too. But it's also funny. We'll let some people in behind the podcast a little bit. We've been doing this just long enough now that we can't really remember everything that we've said on the podcast versus what we've just talked about in our DM on Discord. And so we're constantly trying to feel like, hey, I feel like maybe we talked about that. Did we talk about that? And if so, how long did we talk about that? So I took all the transcripts from all of our podcasts and I pumped it into a private GPT so that I can search against it and I can figure out what we've talked about, what we haven't talked about. And if we have talked about it, how long we talked about it. It's just really funny to ask GPT questions about your own podcast. But it's fun.
That's what technology is for, right?
Yeah. Yeah, if you can't be an expert of your own podcast, you gotta outsource that shit.
That's right. I mean, we need an assistant. And so ChatGPT is our assistant.
Yeah.
Well, like Los Campesinos, we self-produce this album, we self-market it, we do this ourselves, but we need a little help. And that's where ChatGPT comes into play. So.
All right. Well, we thank you guys for listening. It's the Album of Record podcast. Make sure you subscribe on all the platforms. Make sure you go to albumofrecord.com. That we've got a Substack there. It's all completely free, but that's where you can get all the latest and greatest on what we're doing, except the weeks where I forget to post it. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the Album of Record podcast.